Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's ADF webcast. My name is Josh Holdenried, and I serve as Vice President and Executive Director of Napa Legal Institute. Napa Legal Institute is an allied organization of ADFs as we both work to advance the cause of religious liberty. For that reason, it's an immense pleasure, and I'm very grateful to be guest hosting today's webinar. Through this conversation, we hope to learn more about faith-based leaders across the country and how they are responding to the coronavirus pandemic. So just a quick word about my organization before we get started. Napa Legal Institute focuses on corporate education and legal resources for religious nonprofits. To that end, we focus on things like corporate governance, tax compliance, employment law, and a litany of other issues related to nonprofit sophistication. And again, for that reason, we are so grateful to be allied with Alliance Defending Freedom as they focus on the similar mission that we have, which is to empower evangelization, which in turn empowers America. So as you all know, a lot has been going on this week, and which is why we're going to get into that with our conversation today with our esteemed panelists. First, we have Father John Langlois. He is the president of the Dominican House of Studies. And we also have with us Howie Slug, co-founder and legal counsel of the Jewish Coalition for Religious Liberty. And finally, we have Ryan Tucker, senior counsel and head of ADF Center for Christian Ministries. Thank you again for all of you for being with us today. And as we get the conversation started, let's begin with Father John. Father John, how are you?
Great, Josh. Great to be with you.
Thank you for joining us. Just as a fun note to our viewers, when Napa Legal Institute got started just at the beginning of last year, I was looking for office space, and Father John was kind enough to let me use the office space at the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, D.C. So as I moved in there, I sort of stood out as kind of a sore thumb because I was the only one not wearing a habit. So it was a bit awkward at first, but I had such a wonderful time. I know, I miss being there. But it was such a wonderful time being there. We're so grateful for you, for all the help that you provided both ADF and Napa Legal Institute. So I was first hoping that you could kind of give us a little bit of insight into what the Dominican House of Studies is and what your role as president there and what you're doing during the time of crisis.
Great. Yes, so I'm the president here at the Dominican House of Studies, and basically we're a small seminary primarily focused on educating our own Dominican brothers, preparing them for the priesthood, but we're also working to educate other seminarians, as well as lay people. So we're a graduate school of theology at the same time. And basically what we provide our students is a long tradition, an 800-year-old tradition of intellectual formation that goes back both to our founder, St. Dominic, but also to our most important Dominican brother, St. Thomas Aquinas, and the great intellectual legacy that he left to the church. So we form our students in the Thomistic intellectual tradition. And that basically involves the synthesis of faith and reason. So proposing the truths of the faith and showing how they are in fact reasonable, and that people can accept them not simply on faith, but also that they make sense according to reason.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for that. So from your perspective, and perhaps the perspective of other faithful Catholics across the country, what does it look like to really commit to your faith during a time of crisis? I think that's something that a lot of us are kind of looking to try and understand, why would something like this happen? How do we sort of work on our interior life during a time like this? Could you sort of give us the Catholic perspective on that?
Yeah, absolutely, Josh. And, when I got the question ahead of time, an image came to mind immediately. And I thought of the Lord as providing that image himself. I'm thinking specifically of the incident on the boat in the Sea of Galilee when he's on the boat with the disciples. And all of a sudden, a storm comes up, out of nowhere. And it's just like this COVID virus, right? It snuck up on us and came out of nowhere. And immediately our lives have changed and our lives have become very turbulent. So what does Jesus teach us in that incident? The apostles are panicking, right? They're all terrified. They think they're going to drown. And Jesus is asleep. He's asleep. And the apostles can't believe it, right? And they wake him up. Lord, don't you care that we're about to drown? Now, what is that all about? Jesus sleeping in the midst of a storm. He's teaching us a lesson. He's teaching us that no matter how turbulent life becomes, we can be at rest as well, as he was at rest in the love of the Father. That's what allowed him to be at rest. in this storm. And I think the Lord is teaching us in the midst of this crisis to turn to him and to find our peace, to find our rest in his love, and that he's going to provide for us. He's going to take care of us. But do we trust in that? See, this is a test of faith for all of us.
Absolutely. I think that's so true. And that's such a beautiful story from the Bible. Thank you for sharing that with us. And as you know, we're entering into Holy Week, which is for Catholics and others, the most important week of our liturgy. And I mean, that's just a beautiful thing to reflect on. Are there some other things that Catholics should be reflecting on during this specific time, in Holy Week, but not just Holy Week, but a Holy Week that is really a time of great uncertainty and a time of real faith?
Holy Week is falling at the most opportune time, I think, because it gives us an opportunity to focus on what is the real life-changing event for all of us, and that is the death and resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ. That has changed human life forever. He's made eternal life possible for us through his death and resurrection. So that becomes our focus during Holy Week. And we focus particularly on his passion, his sufferings. Now, the word passion is interesting because it has several different meanings. Passion, first of all, it refers to suffering, but we also use it to refer to ardent love, right? It can mean, if we say someone is passionate about something, it means he really loves something. And so the two come together in Christ, right? His sufferings become the demonstration of his absolute love for us, the fact that he's willing to undergo the intense torture, the agony, the humiliation, everything that he suffers, it's all out of love for us and to save us. And I know it's my experience, sometimes I get caught up in my own sufferings and I think, oh, woe is me, things are so awful right now. And then, I hear about or I see someone else who is suffering so much more than I. And that becomes a reality check, just put things into perspective. It's like, oh, okay, yeah, my sufferings are not all that bad, actually. And when we focus on the sufferings of Christ, that becomes the ultimate reality check. None of us will ever suffer as he suffered for us. None of us. And so when we look and meditate on his sufferings, again, our burden becomes lighter. First of all, because we see that he suffered so much more, but also we know that he's with us in our sufferings. And furthermore, we have the opportunity in our own sufferings to unite them with Christ's on the cross. And when we do that, our sufferings have meaning and purpose. We Christians believe that our sufferings become salvific. They contribute to helping to save others because they are united with the sufferings of Christ on the cross. So that becomes a very beautiful meditation for all of us, I think. Whatever sufferings we're experiencing during this time, we can unite those sufferings to the sufferings of Christ.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Father John. And just a final two-part question. One, as the president of the Dominican House of Studies, besides also offering spiritual care to your brothers, you also have other responsibilities to them as
Absolutely.
President of an organization during a difficult time. I was wondering how you, from a sort of organizational standpoint, what are your greatest concerns going forward in these next days and weeks in terms of kind of running the Dominican House of Studies? And then you maybe reflect on just a quick story, if you have one, that has given you some real encouragement during this time of crisis.
Great, thanks, Josh. Yeah, so the biggest concern obviously is the financial question. We had to cancel our major fundraising event of the year, our spring gala, because of all the restrictions, And when I had to do that, of course, it was with great heaviness of heart, thinking, oh my gosh, this is going to mean a significant loss of income. How in the world are we going to make that up? And so as soon as I had to do that, I immediately put the whole situation in the Lord's hands. I said, Lord, this is beyond me. You take care of it. You take care of it. And you know what? He is. I mean, I have to say that the Lord is taking care of things. So we decided to go ahead with a special appeal to our donors. Again, we hesitated, thinking, gee, everybody's suffering at this point. Should we really be making an ask? But what we're discovering is that those who support us are willing to be there for us in this time of need. So even though they may be experiencing financial difficulties themselves, they are giving generously. So the appeal is off to a very promising start. And again, that's been a testimony to me of God's providence and how if we have faith, he really does take care of us. We don't have to worry.
That's wonderful. And actually, that totally ties into your earlier story from the Bible about having faith on waters that are otherwise choppy, and the Lord is asleep and at rest because there's faith, and you have that faith, and that's what got you through. So thank you so much, Father John, for offering that perspective. Now we're going to go ahead and turn over to Howie Slug, who is the co-founder and legal counsel to the Jewish Coalition for Religious Liberty. Howie, how are you today?
I'm doing really well. Happy to be here.
Great, it's good to see you. So I was hoping before we get into the Jewish perspective on Passover and this time of difficulty for the Jewish community, if you could just tell us a little bit about the Jewish Coalition for Religious Liberty and sort of why you co-founded this organization and what its relationship is to ADF.
Sure. The Jewish Coalition for Religious Liberty is a nonprofit where we do work to promote education and to give a Jewish voice in the religious liberty discussion. We do amicus briefs in a lot of the cases that ADF works on. Actually, right over my shoulder is a plaque that Jack Phillips gave me that signed to thank us for the amicus brief we wrote in Masterpiece Cake Shop at the Supreme Court. We founded it to give a specific and continuing Jewish voice in these types of situations. Not only do we do work on amicus briefs, we've also done some cases. We sued FEMA along with Beckett about FEMA not giving hurricane relief to shuls, mosques, and churches that were damaged in hurricanes based on a misunderstanding of the Establishment Clause. And we sued and won in that case. And Congress also passed a statute prohibiting FEMA from discriminating against religious organizations. We've also done work on behalf of rabbis who want to put menorahs up in public parks around Hanukkah time and have been told they're not allowed to do so, again, because of a misunderstanding of the Establishment Clause. And just in general, to refocus, there's been this pernicious myth that religious liberty mostly protects the majority and mostly protects Christians, and is some kind of a battle between Christians and other, quote unquote, oppressed minorities. And we want to remind people that in reality, religious liberty mostly protects minority religions. Not only are cases disproportionately brought by members of minority faiths, Native Americans, Muslims, Jews, and the like, but we're the ones who need it the most because our practices are the most unfamiliar, the most likely to draw public attention. And in a world that we live in where the free exercise clause only applies to laws that target religious faith specifically, the people who are most likely to be incidentally burdened by religion are those whose practices lawmakers don't know about. And it's religious minorities who are the most likely to have their practices not known about. So it's our job to remind judges and lawmakers that they have to be, wary of protecting our minority religious faiths as well.
That's a great overview. Thank you so much, Howie. And I love that you've got a plaque from Jack Phillips on your wall. I mean, that just really, to me, illustrates the alliance in Alliance Defending Freedom, where ADF is always focused on building bridges with other communities, including the Jewish communities and others, to protect everyone's religious liberty. So that's a great story. Thank you so much for sharing that. So I was wondering if you could also give us maybe some insight from a faith perspective on how your faith community in particular might be responding to the coronavirus pandemic right now.
So mostly I'm a lawyer, but I can definitely give a shot at that. So the coronavirus came around at a really difficult time for Jews. It first started to become an issue right before the holiday of Purim, which was March 9th of this year, which is a holiday in which Jews usually congregate in synagogue to read the story of Esther. And there's a tradition of giving your friends and family gifts of food and having a big communal meal in the evening on the day of Purim. And people hadn't really been social quarantining yet as early as March 9th. And that there was significant damage done because of that. But things shut down almost immediately thereafter, right? There's a story about, in the popular press, about religious Jews not taking this as seriously as some others. And I think that's just totally false. By that Friday night, we had already started shutting down synagogues and shutting down big meals in a way that would have been unimaginable 2 or 3 months ago. A lot of people, a lot of Orthodox Jews meet to pray with a quorum 3 times a day, every single day, at least 10 men in synagogue. And many synagogues are packed every Friday night, Saturday day. And that has been shut down since right after March 9th, since March 11th or 12th, whatever that Friday night was. And right now, it is by far the longest they've ever gone without praying with a quorum of 10 men, without having not heard the Torah read publicly. I had never gone more than at most a week or two if there had been a hurricane or if I had been sick or whatever. Now it's been weeks and weeks. It's a thing that is totally unimaginable. A religion that is extremely communal and extremely based on those sorts of communal activities has completely stopped them. I often host Friday night meals. There's a idea in the Jewish community to have big communal meals on Friday night. We're restricted in a lot of things that we can do on the Sabbath, can't cook, can't use electricity. And one thing you can do is get together with your friends and family and have a really nice meal that you cook before the Sabbath starts. And almost every week I'll host 10 people, we'll have a nice meal, we'll play board games, we'll hang out for hours. And I haven't done that. That has just completely stopped in a way that's completely unfamiliar. So life has been severely changed and disrupted. And in a minute we'll get to Passover, which is going to be a very interesting situation this year.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that was actually going to be my next question. I was glad you gave us sort of an overview of Purim and sort of the significance of that holiday and religious practice, and then moving now to Passover. And just for some of our friends who maybe are not as familiar with the tradition of Passover, could you kind of give us just a brief overview of what that is and the importance of that to the Jewish communities?
Yeah, so Passover is the commemoration of the Exodus from Egypt, although you're supposed to experience it as if you were actually leaving Egypt, and it's not merely a commemoration. So commemoration isn't exactly the right word, but it's an experience of leaving Egypt. And it is also a very communal event. In America, in Israel, you have one night, and in America, you have 2 nights of meals called seders, which literally means order, and you go through an order of events. And the organizing principle of that is to get children to ask questions and to teach your children about the significance of the holiday. And every event you dip food into items, salt water and a sweet mix. You do all kinds of other things to prompt children to ask questions. And one part of the Seder is actually inviting in anyone who doesn't have a meal and anyone who might be needy to come and join you. So it has a very communal element to it. And a lot of work goes into preparing for the holiday because we observe kosher laws all year, but on Passover, everything is turned up by a magnitude of 10 because you're not allowed to have any leavened products. And we generally take an extremely strict view of that and also prohibit things that may have once reminded us of leavened products, like corn and rice. At least Jews of Eastern European descent do this. And it involves cleaning your entire house, turning over all of the food that you normally have. And in general, people spend it with their families. I'm 36 years old, and every year of my life, I've spent it with my parents. I've never been alone on Passover before. This is gonna be the first time, and I've been staying up late into the night, cleaning my oven. You have to remove all traces of leaven from your oven if you're gonna use it on the holiday. Cleaning out my pantries, stocking all new food that I haven't previously had, and getting ready for the holiday. And it's been quite an endeavor. And this year, the holiday starts on Wednesday night, and we're prohibited to use electricity on a holiday. So no Zoom or Skype or telephones. So it is for single people. I'm married, I'm single. So for me, it's gonna be 3 days in my apartment by myself of the holiday, which is quite extraordinary. It's not a thing that people normally experience. And there's been a lot of work on religious levels of incorporating whatever leniencies we can find, but also keeping stringencies, because we certainly don't want to adopt leniencies that will last forever and change the way the faith looks in an ongoing fashion. We also don't want to impose, unnecessarily harsh burdens on people. So there's an attempt to try and find ways to, deal with the specific exigent circumstances of this year in ways that will mitigate, the potential harm to people, but also to keep religious traditions intact.
Well, thank you, Howie. That was an amazing overview. It is a challenging time for all of us across the faith-based community, but I can see how it's especially challenging for the Jewish community for the reasons that you just stated. So thank you again for sharing those. I think what we're going to do now is move over to chat with Ryan Tucker from ADF to get some sort of idea of sort of the religious liberty concerns around different acts that have been passed and different guidances that have been issued by the administration. So Ryan, it's good to see you, and thanks again for letting us do this with you today.
Good to see you. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. So I know that ADF has probably been receiving several calls about whether the government has the right to prevent religious services from taking place due to social distancing guidelines. Could you kind of share some thoughts and insights on that? And so what are some of your religious liberty concerns with how the government can maybe prevent people from getting together for religious services?
Sure. Well, states certainly have the obligation or the authority, at least, to protect the health and safety of their citizens. But the power to do so is not unlimited. You've got certain constitutional concerns, principles that come into play. So you have assembly, you have free speech, you have free exercise concerns. And as you mentioned, we have seen a lot or heard a lot from the church and religious community, many phone calls each and every day. We have gotten hundreds of these calls about, can the church be closed? Can the state really do this? And in each situation, we have to look at that specific jurisdiction. I wish there was a broad answer to a number of the questions that we get, but unfortunately there's not. So when we receive a phone call, we look at that particular jurisdiction. We see whether there's a state order in place. In addition to that, is there a local order in place? And so we have to analyze each of those orders, look to see, is the church itself being targeted? Are these temporary restrictions? Are these being evenly applied? Again, is the church being singled out? We've seen instances where there are actual orders that say in their title, church closure orders. So you have instances where counties, jurisdictions are targeting the church. And fortunately, we saw that in Indiana. In fact, the Attorney General of Indiana came out and condemned that. Fortunately, that particular order was rescinded. You've seen statements in the public. We saw Mayor de Blasio's comments about permanent closure, which clearly is unconstitutional. So again, if you're looking at temporary restrictions, evenly applied, not targeting the church, then most often those restrictions, if challenged in court, would be upheld, at least during a national pandemic like this.
Right. I mean, it's a difficult thing to kind of figure out what the prudential decision is for a lot of these local and state government leaders between public health and religious liberty. So it's really is, sometimes splitting hairs and trying to make sure, as you were saying, things are evenly applied. So thank you again for offering some insight on that. And of course, kind of staying on this track of thought, as we all know, the Kerrs Act was recently passed, and a lot of folks are wondering how that act is going to impact faith-based organizations specifically. And there's been a lot of analysis that's been released since then. But I was wondering if you could just give us a quick review, maybe just a few key takeaways from the Kerrs Act for faith-based organizations.
Sure. Well, for folks that joined us last Thursday, there were a ton of questions that had not been answered. There's still some open questions, no doubt. But last Thursday during a webinar that we hosted, we had not yet really had an opportunity to look at the interim rule. The SBA, the Small Business Administration, released some guidance specific to the Kerrs Act and had some favorable language included in it. There was a paragraph or two talking about religious liberty concerns. And during our last webinar discussion, I mentioned the fact that on page 4 of the application for the payment protection plan, for example, the application that individuals were receiving, there was concerns about a non-discrimination clause. And fortunately, over the weekend, in fact, early Saturday morning, the SBA released some additional guidance on that, some frequently asked questions that are very helpful. I think they underscore what we believe to be the case going into our discussion last week on it. Now, there are still some questions percolating out there. There's still a lot of confusion. There's still a lot of banks that are trying to get their arms around this. And there's obviously a lot of churches and religious organizations debating, even if they are eligible, do they want to do it? And that's something that each institution has to figure out for themselves. But one thing I would point out, though, is these funds are for sustainment use for ongoing operations. And so if your particular church or organization does not need these funds, this is not simply the government saying, here's free money, come take it. The analysis is broader than that, deeper than that. It needs to be justifiable. And so I would just caution you there. And certainly there are nuances if you run a religious school. I think there's some open questions as to how states themselves may interpret this. We know what the administration's take on it is, and certainly this administration has been very favorable towards people of faith. But statewide, you never know what's going to happen. Howie mentioned Jack Phillips, and again, that's apples and oranges perhaps to our discussion today. But I think it underscores the point that there are states that may view things a little bit differently, and so you definitely want to talk to someone with knowledge on the topic, whether it's calling ADF to obtain advice or someone locally.
That's great, thank you. And yeah, at Napa Legal Institute, we've been kind of looking at the same thing and still wondering, even if with the guidelines that are favorable, that whether there's still some concerns being subject to, again, some religious liberty concerns that we have and that you share. So thank you for that overview. So I was wondering, again, on the topic of resources, what is the church and ministry team putting out in particular as a resource for someone who might want to go to the ADF website and figure out a little bit more about, again, how these laws are impacting their faith-based organization?
Sure. Well, at ADF, we have a couple elements of our organization here that delve specifically into protection of religious liberty as it relates to the church, but also as to other religious organizations. We call that the ADF Church Alliance and the ADF Ministry Alliance. You can go to adfchurchalliance.org and view the resources there, see what is available for folks that join that membership program. Same thing for the Ministry Alliance as well. But one thing we are going to make available to everyone, we've got 3 different publications that we intend to place on the website. They should be up there very soon, if not currently. One deals with sort of 5 things to know, like what's important, from a high level perspective, but what's important for an institution, a church to consider when determining whether they want to take or consider taking funds. We've also got a resource touching on the religious liberty implications of this new stimulus bill. How does the Kerrs Act relate to religious liberty concerns that have been shared with us? And a lot of this is driven, honestly, by phone calls that we're receiving. So we look at, is this a broad concern to the general populace across the United States? So again, we receive hundreds of calls, and so we try to distill those, and we have a frequently asked question resource that'll be part of that as well. And so be on the lookout for that. Again, you'll be able to find that on the ADF Church Alliance website and the Ministry Alliance as well.
Great, thank you, Ryan. And you kind of touched on it a little bit, but I was just wondering for certain church leaders or faith-based organizational leaders that are watching this right now, what are, again, maybe it's based off the FAQ sheet that you're working on or the key takeaways you're working on, but what is the one thing that churches and religious organizations should be doing or thinking about right now, like this week and the week next?
Well, I'll answer that twofold. One with Kerrs Act in mind, and the other with gathering restrictions, because I know that people watching this probably have concerns on both ends. As to the Kerrs Act, again, I would caution you to consider, is this money really needed is it necessary for the immediate time period? There are some provisions in there talking about the need to confirm that those funds were indeed necessary for that. I know there's the uncertainty portion that a lot of people are pointing to, but I would just remind the viewers to just be cautious with that, not simply to look at it and say, well, this is just money that's out there, maybe we should just go take it. I would caution you really to do that. And again, if you need further guidance on that or any of these topics, you can reach us at adflegal.org. There's a legal help button at the top there that you can click on and reach out to us for that. I would say secondarily, again, we sort of led with a discussion about gathering restrictions. That continues to be extremely important topic, certainly this week of all weeks. And just this morning, in fact, we have received a handful, at least, of phone calls from churches who, over the weekend, their services were interrupted by local enforcement authorities who wrongly pointed out to them their violation, whether it's maybe they were live streaming, maybe it was a drive-in, maybe it was a situation where there are no gathering restrictions. And so, local authorities, unfortunately, these orders are very vague. And so when you have a vague order and you combine that with potential criminal penalties, that's a recipe for problems. And so just being knowledgeable of what orders are in place in your particular jurisdiction, and if there's questions or if you receive an inquiry from a local official, or if you think that local officials are stating things targeting the church, we certainly want to know about it and to evaluate those to see whether we need to step into those situations ourselves. We've had to send letters out from ADF to seek clarification and to get guidance for churches that are seeking it.
Great. Well, thank you, Ryan. That was a wonderful overview. Greatly appreciate that. And now we're going to move into the Q&A section for the remainder of the webinar. And so we'll start the first question, which is actually related to Napa Legal Institute. How has NLI partnered with ADF in any way to provide resources related to coronavirus? This is actually a great question to highlight the fact that Alan Sears, the founder of ADF, sits on the board of Napa Legal Institute, and he's been kind enough to actually draft and write 2 blog posts for us that are now live on our website. One blog post is about 5 key principles for crisis leadership, and the other post is about how to engage your board during a time of crisis. So again, it's a wonderful sort of illustration of the partnership that Napa Legal Institute continues to engage with ADF as we both sort of advance the cause of religious liberty, especially during a time like this of great difficulty. So now we'll move on to the second question, which is for you, Father John. So Father John, what are some final reflections for Catholics before Easter? You and I we were just sort of talking about that earlier, but I was wondering if you could maybe give us some kind of concluding thoughts as the Easter season is in full swing, and kind of let Catholics know what they should be reflecting on in particular during this time, whether it's faith or the Passion or other things.
Another passage that comes to mind is the raising of Lazarus, which we had liturgically just before Palm Sunday. And in that particular episode, Lazarus is Jesus's very dear friend, right? And Jesus gets news that he's very sick, and yet he delays for a couple days before going to him. His sisters had sent news, your friend is very sick, come. And the expectation was that Jesus would get there in time and that he would heal Lazarus. But no, he allows Lazarus to die. But he says, this death this episode is not to end in death. It's for the greater glory of God. And I think that is a powerful message for all of us to hear today in our experience of this coronavirus, that God is allowing it for some good. It seems like a great evil to us, and it's causing a lot of suffering. And certainly people are dying from it. But through it all, God only allows suffering and evil in order to bring a greater good out of it. And it's going to be to his glory. So I think that's what we have to keep focused on here. Yes, it's a scary thing, but if we trust in him and his power, he will bring good out of this situation. He will bring new life. And I do think that's what we can hope for, is that there's going to be new life for the church, new life for society that arises out of this present experience.
Thank you so much for that, Father John. We greatly appreciate that. The next question is for Howie. From the perspective of the Jewish community, where do you see the greatest area of need for religious liberty education and protection after COVID-19?
So after COVID-19 specifically is to be a somewhat interesting question, in that I think as COVID-19 is going on, there has to be somewhat of a balance between when we give things up, such as accepting distancing orders, which we ought to do. how do we balance between those who fight back and they risk discrediting religious liberty and saying it's too obstinate and it doesn't recognize the state's authority enough, and how much do we give in and risk not getting back rights? So there's a difficult balance there, which I think to some extent that balance has plagued the Jewish community even before COVID-19, in not necessarily wanting to be the loudest voice in the fight, in fear of standing out too much, but also not wanting to give up on religious liberties, and finding that balance of when do we fight back against zoning ordinances under RLUIPA, the Religious Land Use Institutionalized Persons Act, that unduly restrict the building of synagogues? How do we work for various religious liberty exemptions? Or when do we fight in court, and when do we fight in the public sphere, and when do we bury our heads? I think is very much and try and get by as much as possible, whether it's in the adoption and foster care cases that are currently being fought about, the right of religious agencies to adopt and foster care to people in their own community, to preference people in their own community, or whether it's in terms of schools being able to, and other organizations, to hire leaders in their own community. How much emphasis do we put on avoiding the limelight, and how much emphasis do we put on protecting our interests, is an ongoing conversation that I think is even further highlighted by COVID-19.
You're absolutely right. It is an ongoing conversation. And we thank you for joining us to do that with us today. So thank you again, Howie. That was excellent. So we'll move on to Ryan, and I've got a couple questions for you, Ryan, again, related to what you and I were just talking about. The first is in terms of when we're talking, someone asked when it comes to these temporary restrictions, and when it comes to gatherings for like religious services, what does temporary mean? How long is temporary, and how is that being dealt with through the law?
Great question. And this is new ground for everyone. And I actually just 2 hours ago was having a similar conversation, and I was concerned about, for example, Virginia. The governor there at the end of March instituted an order that basically put these restrictions in place through June 10th. And so when you add those days up, you're looking at over 2 months, 70 days, basically, from the start of the latest order to the potential ending point. Now, I recognize that some of these may be rescinded, they may be amended, but as we look at these restrictions, I think a 2-week temporary ban is certainly more palatable, if not more enforceable, than say a 2-month and beyond type restriction. And so I don't think there's an exact answer to that. You have to look too at where you're at. For example, if you're in the middle of a state that has had very little outbreak and it's rural, how can you justify a ban for an extended period of time? You have to tailor your restriction to what it is that you're attempting to resolve here. And so you have to look at it and say, is what the government doing here, is it tailored enough? Is it tailored to take care of the problem? And so again, there's no perfect answer to that question, but as I look at these orders that are of 10, 14-day magnitudes, to me, I think are more likely to withstand a challenge than say one that goes well beyond that.
Excellent. Well, it's encouraging to hear that you all are thinking about that and tracking it, because I could see how that could be a great concern to folks. Like if you're, again, like you're mentioning, in the rural area where, a weeks and months on end wouldn't make much sense, versus, hey, if you're in the heart of New York City, which seems to be on complete lockdown. So that's really helpful. Another question for you, Ryan. So the viewer asks, I read online about an issue with the Benham brothers and pro-life advocates being arrested. Can ADF do anything about this?
Well, we're very, very concerned about a multitude of people in this arena. We're looking not just at church and religious gathering situations, but also we had, in addition to that incident you just mentioned last week in North Carolina, there was a group of individuals that were out in compliance with the restriction, exercising in front of near an abortion clinic, and they were arrested. And so we actually sent a letter to the local officials concerning that. There's actually litigation in that arena. There's litigation overall. If you look in Texas, Oklahoma, some other states that also have some restrictions, this is a growing issue, and we are aware of that, and we are looking into each and every situation, including the incident you just mentioned.
Well, thank you, Ryan. That was absolutely helpful. I know a lot of people out there are concerned and still looking for information and resources related to these challenging times, whether it's exercising your rights under the First Amendment or when it comes to whether you can gather for religious services. I know a lot of different faith-based organizations and communities have moved all their things to online or virtual. But of course, like say, if you're a Catholic organization, that's difficult because you can't receive the Eucharist virtually. Or say if you're part of the Jewish community, you can't celebrate Purim, where you're gathered with everyone, friends and family alike. So it really is important during this time of great uncertainty and difficulty to stay educated and stay updated with everything related to what's going on with coronavirus. And of course, what we would maybe call the unintended consequences, or maybe even bad actors out there trying to capitalize on this crisis. So again, I want to go ahead and just thank our panelists for being with us here today. All of you provided wonderful insights from your respective faith-based traditions and communities, and also to Ryan for giving us a great sort of brief legal overview of what's going on right now out there related to the Kerrs Act, what it might mean to apply for a loan, whether you should apply for a loan. And to that end, I'd like to point out to the audience that there are resources available through this webinar on your screen related to things that you can learn from both ADF and Napa Legal Institute related to how to navigate yourself through this crisis as an organization. And of course, I want to thank Alliance Defending Freedom for giving me the opportunity to guest host today's webinar. It's always a pleasure to partner with my friends at ADF. And thank you so much, and God bless everyone, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.